All right, strap in, everyone. Today, we're diving headfirst into some seriously choppy economic waters. We're talking U.S. trade deficit and those tariffs President Trump just kind of dropped on China, Mexico, and Canada.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Our source today, it's a transcript of a YouTube video that really breaks this whole thing down.
Okay, so, what's the big question here? Genius power move? Or are we, setting off a global economic, I don't even know, explosion?
Think about it. You buy stuff, imported stuff.
Right.
What's your gut feeling about all this international trade stuff?
It's funny you should mention that because it's so easy to think about economics like it's this far off thing. But honestly, it's all connected to us, to real life,
Yeah, for sure.
So first things first, let's unpack this whole trade deficit thing.
Okay, yeah, break it down.
Basically, it's the difference between how much a country brings in, imports versus how much it sends out, exports.
And the source material actually has this crazy chart showing the U.S. trade deficit over time. And let me tell you, it is not a pretty picture. It's like a roller coaster, but only going up.
And that roller coaster, well, it's a real number, a really big number with a really big impact. We're talking a $78.2 billion deficit for November 2024.
Okay, so the U.S. bought $78.2 billion more from other countries than it sold to them. But, for those of us who don't, spend all day thinking about this stuff, what does it actually mean for the U.S. economy,
Think of it kind of like being in debt to the rest of the world. Not always a bad thing, short term. But if it keeps growing, well, it can start to raise some red flags about, whether the U.S. economy is sustainable, long term.
So then we get President Trump stepping in with these tariffs. And we're not talking about a small tweak here. 25% on stuff from Mexico and Canada, 10% on stuff from China. Those are big players, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're not talking about the corner store down the street here. These are some of the U.S.'s biggest trading partners. Mm-hmm. The U.S.'s first, third, and 10th largest, actually.
Wow.
And get this, the combined trade deficit with just those three countries, $45.7 billion in November 2024.
So yeah, the source mentions Trump's concerns about stuff like fentanyl coming from China through Mexico. Mm-hmm. But it seems like this trade imbalance thing, that's a major factor.
It seems that way, yeah. And actually, the source material has this audio clip of President Trump announcing these tariffs. Let me tell you, he does not mince words.
Let's hear it.
It's pretty direct.
Promises made, promises kept. Huh? That's strong. But what does it actually look like when those imports, those everyday things from Mexico, Canada, China, what happens when they get more expensive? On the ground.
Okay, so let's start with Mexico. They send a whopping 80% of their exports to the U.S. So imagine suddenly there's less demand for those products, businesses are struggling, people are losing their jobs.
So what you're saying is those tariffs could have this ripple effect through the whole Mexican economy.
Exactly, like a chain reaction. And then there's Canada. 75% of their exports go to the U.S., a lot of it energy products. So could this backfire? Could we end up with an energy crunch here in the U.S.?
So we rely on them for energy, but we're making it more expensive to get it.
That's the risk. And the question is, can the U.S. find other sources of energy fast enough? And will those sources be, more expensive? Energy dependence is a complicated issue, and these tariffs, they could definitely throw a wrench in things.
Okay. And then there's, the big ones, China, the EU.
Sure.
The source points out that they're also impacted, although maybe not as much percentage-wise, in terms of how much they send to the U.S.
Right, but even though the percentage might be smaller, China exports a ton of stuff. So even a small drop in U.S. demand could have a huge impact there. The source actually asks this really interesting question. Could Chinese companies just, eat that 10% tariff by lowering their prices?
Like a price war.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound good.
Not really. Think about it. Chinese companies are already dealing with falling prices, and then they have to lower them even more just to stay competitive. That could create a very unstable situation.
And the EU, with its 27 countries, those tariffs, it seems like they're just adding another layer of uncertainty, for businesses that are already trying to figure out this whole global landscape.
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected everything is, What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects everywhere.
So we've got this massive trade deficit, these new tariffs, and potential economic fallout in countries around the world. It's all starting to sound pretty bleak, but is there another side to this? Could these tariffs actually be good for the U.S.?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that tariffs, they can be used strategically. Sometimes a little bit of protectionism can help boost domestic industries and protect jobs.
So maybe it's not all doom and gloom. These tariffs could actually help the U.S. economy.
It's possible. When imported goods get more expensive, American-made products can become more appealing to consumers. That could lead to more demand for U.S.-made stuff, a revival of manufacturing here, and more jobs.
That makes sense, but, I mean, isn't there a chance that consumers end up paying the price? Literally? Like, won't we all just end up paying more for stuff?
It's a trade-off.
Right.
Maybe consumers benefit from a stronger economy and more jobs, but they might also face higher prices for some things. It's a tough one, no easy answers. It makes you wonder, are people willing to pay more for stuff made in America if it means supporting businesses here?
That's a tough one. There are a lot of moving parts here, and it's hard to say what's going to happen. But one thing's for sure, it's fascinating, and it definitely matters.
Absolutely. And, the source material, it talks about this idea of creating a level playing field with tariffs.
A level playing field, what does that even mean in terms of, international trade? It's not like we're all playing by the same rules.
It comes up a lot in these discussions. The idea is that some countries do things that give their industries an unfair advantage, like subsidizing their businesses or manipulating their currency.
So they're, like, cheating.
You could say that. People who support tariffs, they argued that tariffs level the playing field, so American businesses aren't at a disadvantage.
It's like saying, hey, if you're going to play dirty, we're going to make it harder for you to win. But, I mean, doesn't that assume that the U.S. is always playing fair?
That's a good point. I mean, no country's perfect when it comes to international trade. There are always going to be gray areas, disagreements about what's fair. And that's where things get messy.
It feels like this whole thing is a tug-of-war, with everyone pulling in different directions. But if everyone's just focused on winning, doesn't everyone kind of lose in the end?
That's the danger of a trade war. It becomes this back and forth where each side is just trying to hurt the other economically, and eventually it hurts the global economy, businesses, and consumers. Nobody wins.
Okay, so trade wars are bad. Got it. But if tariffs are this blunt instrument, and we're trying to avoid a trade war, what are the other options?
Well, one approach is to, focus on increasing U.S. exports. Like, imagine if we could open up new markets for American businesses, make it easier for them to sell their stuff around the world.
So instead of trying to block imports with tariffs, we just, focus on selling more of our own stuff.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to compete, effectively, rather than resorting to protectionist measures.
But what about those unfair trade practices we were talking about, like government subsidies and stuff? If other countries are giving their businesses an advantage, how can American companies even compete?
That's where things like international cooperation and diplomacy come in. The U.S. can work with other countries to create clear rules for international trade and make sure everyone's following them. It's about creating a more level playing field, but through collaboration, not punishment.
So it's not about isolating ourselves or trying to punish other countries. It's about working together to create a system that works for everyone.
Exactly. And that leads us to another important point. Investing in America's future. Remember how the source material talked about investing in education and infrastructure?
Right, like having a more skilled workforce and improving the systems that support businesses.
Exactly. Think about a workforce with the skills and knowledge to compete in the 21st century economy, and a modern infrastructure that makes it easier for businesses to transport goods, access markets, and innovate.
So it's not just about tariffs and trade deals. It's about investing in our future, in our people, and the things that make our economy work.
Exactly. It's about creating a strong foundation for economic growth without relying on things like tariffs. It's about investing in American businesses and workers.
So far, we've been talking about the big picture, all the global stuff. But what about our listeners, the everyday people? How does all this affect them?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's easy to get lost in all the jargon, but this stuff impacts all of us in very real ways. And that's exactly what we'll be diving into next. Get ready to find out how these tariffs could affect your wallet, your job, your future. We get caught up in all this talk about trade deficits and tariffs, the big picture stuff, but it's easy to forget about the human side of things.
Right, like how does this actually affect, me? Like how do all these policies and percentages and billions of dollars, how does that trickle down to my everyday life?
Exactly. Let's start with your shopping cart. Think about the things you buy, clothes, electronics, maybe even stuff for that project you've been working on.
Oh no, are you about to call me out on my online shopping habit? I'm trying to be better, I promise.
No, not at all. But a lot of that stuff, it's imported. And with these tariffs, well, those prices, they could start going up. Remember, tariffs are designed to, make imported goods less appealing.
So that new phone I've been saving up for could suddenly be, way out of my budget.
It's possible. And it's not just the big stuff either. We could see prices going up on smaller things, too. Food, certain materials, even the parts that go into making other stuff.
So basically, these tariffs could, fuel inflation. Everything gets more expensive. Groceries, gas, everything.
That's the worry. And, we've already been dealing with inflation, haven't we? This could make things even tougher for people.
We keep talking about how these tariffs could hurt, Mexico and China and stuff. But wouldn't they hurt the U.S. economy too?
Oh, absolutely. If this turns into a trade war, if other countries retaliate, well, American businesses that rely on exports, they could really suffer. Think about it. Less demand for U.S.-made products, factories slowing down production, even job losses.
So these tariffs, which are supposed to help the U.S. economy, could actually end up hurting it. That's a risky move.
It is. It really shows how important it is to think about the unintended consequences. Things aren't always as simple as they seem.
Earlier, you mentioned this idea of a level playing field being the reason for these tariffs. But international trade, it's just inherently uneven, isn't it? Different countries have different strengths and resources and rules. How can you ever really level the playing field?
That's a really complex question. There's so much debate about what level playing field even means when we're talking about trade. Some people say tariffs are necessary to, counter things that give other countries an unfair advantage. Things like government subsidies or currency manipulation.
So some countries are basically, playing by a different set of rules.
That's the argument. People who support tariffs say that they just even things out, so American businesses aren't at a disadvantage.
But doesn't that assume that the U.S. is always playing fair? That we've never done anything, questionable.
You've got a point there. I mean, no country has a perfect record, There are always gray areas, disagreements. It's complicated.
This whole thing feels like a tug of war. Everyone's pulling in different directions, trying to, protect themselves. But if everyone's so focused on winning, doesn't everyone lose in the end?
That's the whole problem with the trade war, isn't it? It just keeps escalating. Each side tries to hurt the other more, and in the end, it just damages the global economy. Businesses get hurt, consumers get hurt. It's a lose-lose situation.
Okay, so trade wars are bad. We get it. But if tariffs are this blunt instrument and we don't want a trade war, what else can we do?
Well, one option is to, focus on increasing U.S. exports. Imagine opening up new markets for American businesses, making it easier for them to sell their goods and services all over the world.
So instead of trying to stop imports, we just focus on, selling more of our own stuff.
Exactly. It's a more proactive approach, finding ways to compete effectively instead of resorting to protectionism.
But what about those unfair trade practices we were talking about, the subsidies and stuff? If other countries are giving their businesses an advantage, how can U.S. companies keep up?
That's where international cooperation comes in. The U.S. can work with other countries to create clear rules and standards, make sure everyone's playing fair. It's about creating a level playing field, but through collaboration, not, punishment.
So it's not about isolating ourselves or punishing other countries. It's about working together to create a system that actually benefits everyone.
Exactly. And that brings us to something else that's really important. Investing in America's future. Remember those suggestions from the source material about investing in education and infrastructure?
Right, like creating a more skilled workforce and updating our infrastructure to support American businesses.
Exactly. Imagine a workforce with the skills and knowledge to compete in the 21st century, and a modern, efficient infrastructure that makes it easier for businesses to, get their products where they need to go and to innovate and grow.
It sounds like you're describing a long-term strategy, something that focuses on building a stronger, more resilient economy.
Exactly. It's about creating a foundation for sustainable economic growth without relying on, quick fixes like tariffs. It's about investing in the future of American businesses and workers.
Okay, so we've talked about the downsides of these tariffs, the higher prices, the economic turmoil, the risk of a trade war. And we've talked about some other options like boosting exports, cooperating with other countries, investing in the U.S. economy.
Right. We've covered a lot of ground, from the global economy to, how this could affect everyday people.
But there's one thing we haven't really talked about yet. What about the human cost of all this? How could these tariffs affect the lives of real people here in the U.S. and around the world? We've talked a lot about trade deficits, tariffs, the global economy, even like the possibility of a trade war.
Hmm.
And it's easy to get caught up in those big ideas, but the reality is these policies, they affect real people.
Yeah, it's like you throw a rock in a pond. Those ripples, they spread out, they touch everything. And those ripples, they can be felt in some pretty unexpected places.
So it's not just like numbers on a spreadsheet. There are actual people whose lives are affected by this.
Exactly. Imagine like a small business owner, right? Somewhere in the Midwest. They need parts from overseas to make their products, and then boom, those tariffs hit. Their materials get way more expensive. Suddenly, they're not making as much profit.
Oof.
So what do? Raise prices, maybe, which makes their products, less competitive?
Yeah.
Or maybe they have to lay off workers just to keep the business going.
Yeah, that really brings it home. It's not just some abstract economic theory. These tariffs can really hurt people.
Yeah.
And what about the people who make those products overseas? The ones in those factories?
That's another huge piece of this whole thing. If demand for those products drops because of the tariffs, well, those workers could face, shorter hours, pay cuts, maybe even lose their jobs. It creates this ripple effect, this hardship that goes way beyond our borders.
And the source material, and it talks specifically about Mexico being really vulnerable because they send so much of their stuff to the U.S. Mm-hmm. What could these tariffs mean for Mexican workers, for their families?
It could be really bad, honestly. Mexico's economy relies a lot on manufacturing, and that employs a ton of people. If those factories have to close or even just slow down, it could be devastating for whole communities.
It really shows how connected we all are, doesn't it? The global economy, what happens in one place affects people all over the world.
Yeah, and the thing is, the impact of these tariffs, it won't be the same for everyone. Some industries, some communities, they're going to be hit harder than others. The source material even talked about the possibility of increased migration if things get really bad in Mexico.
So this isn't just about economics. There are social and political implications too.
Absolutely. When people's jobs are threatened, when they feel like they're running out of options, well, they might have to make some really tough choices.
It's a good reminder that economic policy, it's not just about numbers, It's about people's lives, their families, their hopes and dreams.
Yeah. It's so important to think about the human cost of these policies, the things that might happen that we don't expect that can cause a lot of hardship.
It's a lot to think about. It can feel kind of overwhelming. But we do have a choice, don't we? We can make decisions that shape how this all plays out.
We absolutely do. This deep dive, it's given you the information,
Yeah.
The knowledge. You understand how complicated international trade is, the potential consequences of these tariffs, the other options we have.
It's like you've given us a map,
Yeah.
and a flashlight. We can choose to wander around in the dark, or we can use this knowledge to find our way to a better place.
That's a great way to put it. And it all starts with awareness, Pay attention to what's happening. Stay informed about the policies being debated. Talk to people. Have conversations about the choices we're facing as a society.
So it's not just about listening to this and feeling helpless. It's about taking action, using this knowledge to make informed decisions, and advocating for solutions that benefit everyone.
Exactly. It's about recognizing how connected we all are, understanding that the choices we make have consequences for other people, and working together to create a global economy that's more just, more equitable.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the U.S. trade deficit, tariffs, and their impact on the world.
We hope you've come away from this with a better understanding of how complicated this all is and feeling, a little more empowered to engage with these issues.
Remember, the future isn't set in stone. What happens next? Whether we choose cooperation or conflict, it all depends on the choices we make, individually and as a society.
Stay curious, stay engaged, stay informed. The world needs people who are willing to dive deep, ask the tough questions, and work together to build a better future.